right. Thank you very much for joining us. This is the launching moment for this fall's conference on sports and the LGBT experience. I want to introduce two people, and then they're going to take over for the rest of this time, although you're not really going to take over till. In any case, we have two co-directors of this, and I want to point them out to you because if you have any complaints, take it to them. But also, if you get anything from this conference, that is also their fault. They've done exceptional work putting this together and brought in an exceptional body of people to talk about the LGBT experience in sports. We have Adam Rogers from the Lear Center, who is directing this effort, along with Evan Brody, who is a PhD candidate at the Tom School of USC Annenberg Institute. And they, like I said, have set up an outstanding program for you. I look forward to hearing all sorts of fascinating stuff, and it's your floor. I will not take it again.
Thank you. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for coming today. As Dan said, my name is Evan Brody. I'm a doctoral candidate here at USC. I'm also one of the co-directors, along with Adam Amel Rogers from the Norman Lear Center. On behalf of Adam and myself, I want to take a quick moment, especially to thank Professor Durbin and John Hackett for all of their help in putting together this conference. We also want to welcome you all to what we hope will be a really interesting week of conversations regarding sports and the LGBT experience. So as we were constructing this conference, it was really important for us to think through the diversity of engagements associated with sports and sexuality. Of course, this meant involving professional and collegiate athletes to talk about their personal experiences and engaging with journalists and media professionals about the ways in which these discourses are produced and disseminated. But it was also really important to us to think about critical engagements being made by sports scholars, to think about the way sports culture and sexuality studies have been observed, researched, and documented by academics. So it is with great pleasure that I get to introduce the first panel in our conference this week. We're fortunate enough to have some of the leading sports scholars to sit down and discuss some of their thoughts on the discipline of sports studies and its direct relationship to questions of sexual subjectivity. All three of our panelists have researched and published extensively on the topics of sports, gender, and sexuality, and we've asked if they could spend the next hour and a half engaged in a dialogue of sorts regarding current issues in the field and their take on the past, present, and hopefully the future of academic sports scholarship. So without further ado, I'd like to turn this over to our moderator, Professor Mike Messner. Professor Messner is a professor of sociology and gender studies here at USC, and his teaching and research focuses on gender and sports, men and masculinities, and gender-based violence. He's the author of numerous books, including Taking the Field, Women, Men, and Sports, Power at Play, Sports and the Problem of Masculinity, and It's All for the Kids, Gender, Families, and Youth Sports. Professor Messner is also a former president of the North American Society for the Sociology of Sport, and we're very lucky to have him here with us today. So thanks, Mike. So with that, I'll turn it over to Professor Messner, and thank you again all for joining us today.
Thank you, Evan, and thanks for inviting me to do this. And I also want to just echo something that both of you said, I think, is that you've managed to get three of the top scholar and scholar activists in this field to come to USC to speak about this topic. So those of you who know something about this topic, I'm sure know these people's names and works, and those of you who are new to this topic are in for a treat because you're going to be learning from some of the top people in the world here on this topic. As Evan said, I'm in the Department of, I'm in the Gender Studies program in the Department of Sociology here at USC, and Department of Sociology currently is in this building over here where we're cowering in the growing shadow of the new Annenberg building, which I'm thinking of as the Blue Meanie right now, which is what's going to change. So I'm going to introduce the three panelists. We've asked them to speak for a few minutes each. And then I have a few questions that I can ask them, and depending on the time, I might ask one or two questions, and at some point then I'll open up to the audience for questions and comments, but the idea is to develop some dialogue here. Starting from my far left, Pat Griffin is Professor Emerita in Social Justice Education at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, where her research and writing interests were LGBT issues in education and athletics. She's a founding director of Changing the Game, the Gay and Lesbian Straight Education Network Sports Project, and she regularly consults with the NCAA and college athletic departments on LGBT issues in sports. She's authored many scholarly works, including Teaching for Diversity and Social Justice and the acclaimed book, Strong Women, Deep Closets, Lesbians and Homophobia in Sports. In addition, she's author of Pat Griffin's LGBT Sports blog. Pat Griffin has also received many honors, too many to list here, but including being voted Outsports.com Person of the Year in 2011 for her accomplishments combating homophobia and sexism in sport. In 2012, Dr. Griffin was one of the organizers for the first ever LGBT Sports Summit hosted by Nike to develop a national network of organizations focused on making sports inclusive and respectable for athletes and coaches. And I just mentioned to her that I saw on Facebook the last couple of days that she has been honored again, this time by her alma mater. She's also an accomplished coach and athlete, including having won a bronze medal in the 1994 Gay Games triathlon and a gold medal in the 1998 Gay Games hammer throw. So if anybody's thinking of throwing something, you better watch out. Samantha King is Associate Professor and Acting Director of the School of Kinesiology and Health Studies at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. She's the author of the book Pink Ribbons Incorporated, Breast Cancer and the Politics of Philanthropy, published in 2006, which is the subject of an acclaimed National Film Board documentary of the same name. And I'd say the documentary is acclaimed because the book is such an excellent book as well. In addition to publishing work on the cultural dimensions of sport, health, and the body in scholarly journals and edited collections, she has written for the Toronto Star, the National Post, and the Chronicle of Philanthropy, and CNN.com. She's currently at work on a cultural history of OxyContin in Ontario, a project funded by the Canadian Institutes of Health and Research. And to my immediate left, Jane Caldwell is principal lecturer in the School of Sport and Service Management at the University of Brighton in the UK. Her teaching and research focuses on gender and sexualities in sport and leisure contexts. In particular, she's interested in LGBTQI sport cultures. Her publications span 3 decades and include key work on lesbian, gay, and transgender experiences of sport and physical activity. She's a prolific author, having published many articles in scholarly journals, and her recent books include Sexualities, Spaces, and Leisure Studies, and Women's Football in the UK, continuing with gender analyses. Both published by Taylor and Francis in 2012. Those are, as I said, her most recent. Jane is also an activist and has worked for the Justin campaign and with young LGBT people and recreational sport participation. Why don't we start with Pat, as I've introduced them in order, and then we'll go from there.
We changed the order.
You changed the order. Well, okay. You have to tell the person who's
Sorry
introducing
about that.
you. That's okay. What order are we going in?
Samantha,
Jane.
and then me.
Okay, very good.
Thanks everybody for being here, and thank you especially to the organizers for inviting me. This is a compelling yet challenging juncture at which to reflect on sport and the LGBT experience, given the political and intellectual currents which those of us who live in, or in my case work on, the United States produce, traverse, and inhabit every day. I guess I should pull up this before, sorry. How do we, I'm not much of a word user. How do I get the, oh, cool. Yeah. I mean, not a word user, an off the, okay, perfect, thank you. All right. Okay, it is a moment when the sea change in favor of gay marriage troubles not just professional homophobes, to use Richard Kim's terminology, but also queer anti-assimilationists. It is a moment when new campaigns advocating for the inclusion of trans people in the U.S. military are emerging, to the dismay of trans activists who prefer to question war and direct their energy towards the poverty and criminalization that they view as the most pressing political issues of the day. It is a moment when a professional male athlete coming out is momentous news for some and unremarkable for others. It is a moment when some writers predict or even espouse the end of queer theory, while their critics suggest that such writers simply fail to recognize how this scholarly tradition has diverged across new and productive trajectories since it materialized as a field in the 1990s. When I first received the invitation to speak at this conference, I had these contestations in more in mind as I tried to sort out what I might say. And I should also add that I was reading Robin Wiegman's Object Lessons, which offers a really devastating critique of the disciplinary structures of what she calls field imaginaries, which made reflecting on the past, present, and future of this field very difficult. In the process, I found my thoughts drifting repeatedly to two public figures who seemed to offer me a possible route by which to put finger to key, if not to escape these conundrums, under cover of the fantasies of certainty and closure in which scholars are trained to invest. These figures were WNBA player Brittany Griner and as yet unsigned for this season, NBA player Jason Collins. And it is to them that I turned. I hoped that their stories, which seemed to represent two primary and divergent political attachments that continue to animate the sport and sexuality field, what we might describe in overgeneralizing and inadequate terms as the post-structuralist versus the modernist, or the queer versus the LGBT, might help me formulate some ideas to share with you. Of course, I wouldn't be the first person to think about these two figures together. Collins came out as gay in a personal essay penned for Sports Illustrated just 12 days after Griner, who was already out to herself and many others, publicly confirmed in an interview with SportsIllustrated.com what we were led to assume was a lesbian identity. I say led to assume because if you watch the video, neither the journalist nor the three athletes who are part of the interview use any identity terms to describe Griner, instead speaking of sexuality, of coming out, and of accepting who you are. In a later interview with Kate Fagan of ESPN, Griner self-identifies variously as a strong black lesbian woman, a stud lesbian, and as just BG. Given the proximity of Griner's and Collins' respective announcements, there was a considerable amount of predictable discussion about why Griner's coming out resulted in so little public surprise or media consideration compared with the copious amounts of excited copy devoted to Collins' declaration. That is to say, media pundits rushed to make a big deal of the fact that they themselves were not making a big deal of Griner's announcement because, well, they apparently did not consider it a big deal. Stuck within binary notions of women athletes as gender non-conforming and men athletes as gender conforming, ignoring journalism's own implication in the marginalization of women's sport cultures, forgetting, as Jennifer Doyle argues, to ask for whom Griner's announcement might not be a big deal, and erasing the individual and institutional violence that punishes gender nonconformity on a daily basis. This ritual lament did not seem to shift the discussion about sport and the LGBT experience to any place new. On a brighter note, the prevailing tendency among journalists to use such announcements by black athletes to speak without hesitation, qualification, or irony about homophobia in what is fabricated as a monolithic and intolerant black community prompted powerful pushback, I should say, questioning the implication that an unmarked and unspoken white community is the vehicle through which black lesbians and gays might gain acceptance, comradeship, and freedom. Counter-narratives rejected the notion of a singular black community, highlighted the complex lineages and manifestations of homophobia across racial identities and histories, and probed the erasure of both queer racism and institutionalized whiteness as a vehicle of homophobia. Other interesting things emerged out of these two announcements and their juxtaposition. They just weren't addressed or analyzed by most commentators who, unsurprisingly, stuck with more comfortable scripts. One exception was Griner's interview with Kate Fagan. Fagan presented an unusually forthright description of the ways in which Griner's coach and other athletic department officials at Baylor University, where she played before joining the WNBA, actively prevented her from being out. She also quoted from some of the homophobic, butch-phobic, and racist messages Griner receives on a regular basis, she implies a daily basis, through Twitter and Instagram. And she included matter-of-fact discussions about how Griner experiences and conceptualizes her identities. A second exception was an essay by Grantland writer Wesley Morris titled Brittany Griner and the Quiet Queering of Professional Sports. Morris describes how Griner painted her fingernails orange, a color of her Phoenix Mercury WNBA team, for draft night, which she wore alongside a white tuxedo and other menswear. Morris reads her aesthetic choice not as a form of compensation, the lesbian apologetic 2013 style, but as a sign of playfulness. They feminized her menswear, he writes, but they didn't sell it out. He goes on to suggest that the nails actually serve to naturalize her masculinity, standing at the same time as a subversive marker of the small but increasing genderlessness in professional sports. Admittedly, I don't see Briner's style as a sign of genderlessness, but rather of the proliferation of gender styles, practices, and identities, and the pleasure that might be derived from them. But Morris's general approach represents a clear departure from standard journalistic framings of sport and sexuality. Refusing to allow his narrative to be monopolized by a reductive focus on the closet, he extends his analysis to consider, in his words, straight athletes who dress like lesbian musicians, and picture Brian Wilson, who has treated his years as a San Francisco Giant as an opportunity to paint his fingernails and explore assorted permutations of gay facial hair. At some point, Morris writes, his black beard mutated into a roiling, oily nimbus. Somehow he achieved the inviting menace of an organic farmer with a pleasure garden on Castro Street. With this expansive lens, Morris moves discourse on the sexual and gender politics of sport into broader and more variegated pastures. Morris's piece and a subsequent interview he gave when Collins made his more conventional coming out announcement 12 days later resonated with me, in part because in my own work on queer sport, I have challenged the notion of coming out and the related notion of visibility as unambiguously positive indicators of cultural progress. When we consider the potentials and constraints of celebrity comings out in particular, it seems necessary to recognize that the measurable effect of any one individual coming out is rather infinitesimal, to quote Richard Kim. As he writes, it's only within the smallness of communities and alongside a social movement that our disclosures matter. And he actually wrote that in response to Jodie Foster's rather awkward coming out last year, where he defends her because he says this form of role modeling is so problematic anyway, and the investment we place in it is so is too much. So I thought that was that actually made me rethink and want to draw a distinction between those different very public comings out and other forms of coming out. Moreover, triumphalist notions of coming out tend to reinforce singular and fixed notions of identity, underplay the reality that the experience of the closet and of coming out varies from one person to the next and from one moment to the next, disallow the possibility that for some of us there is simply no gay or lesbian essence to hide or reveal, and fail to recognize that being out of the closet might not be the standard to which all queers necessarily aspire. Indeed, narratives that equate authentic self-knowledge and sexual freedom with outness leave little room for what Enda McCaffrey calls the jouissance of leading a double life that the closet enables. This latter point, which hints at the pleasure that can be derived from abject identifications, also helps me to articulate the slight discomfort I feel when I read pieces such as those penned by Morris and by Fagan. I wonder, that is, if these writers' renderings of non-normative identities, practices, and styles pose a threat to the fun and subversive aspects of queer life, its codes and vernaculars, by making them familiar, intelligible, and unremarkable. But that in turn makes me ask what it is I hope for when I argue, as I have done often, for more queer approaches to the analysis of sport culture. These questions point to a fundamental conundrum of queer studies, and queer sports studies, I would argue. Is a refusal of normalization possible without insistently reviving the normal in order to mark its relation of alterity to it? As Robin Wiegman writes, no identity knowledge, no matter how self-critical and anti-identitarian in its political commitment, can actually succeed in dismantling the target of its resistance without fundamentally undoing itself, and that undoing is ambivalent at best. She continues, to put this conundrum another way, we could say that there is always a good reason for refusing to acknowledge what the survival of our desire requires us to ignore. That scholars of identity knowledges cannot but fail to leave identity behind is not a new observation. And given the hold of identity upon us, upon me, it should come as no surprise that my turn to Greiner and Collins would lead me back to this conclusion. That the survival of my investment, parts of my field's investment in Greiner's story as an exemplar of or route to new configurations of social relations, or more finely tuned political justice, depends on the continued narration of stories such as Collins, so that just at the moment when we feel we've left certain frameworks or objects of study behind, they bounce back at us, demanding critical attention anew.
Before I start, if you have problems understanding my accent, because I've had some problems understanding the LA accent when I arrived here, just
We don't have accents here.
just raise your hand and or ask afterwards. Before I go into my little spiel, I'd like to thank Evan for the email he sent in August whilst I was on holiday. I think I was in New Zealand at the time. And thank you for arranging everything and making it such a smooth, quick visit here. So thank you. And the way I've sort of organised my thoughts is I'm going to look at past, present and future in terms of scholarship of sexuality within sports studies. So mine's, I'm not reading it, but I might read parts of it. And I start with a situation that occurred on Monday morning. I picked up the LA Times, as you do when you go to a new place, and the front page was gay and playing the field story, and then on page 2 was transgender law faces fight. And for me, coming into a new environment, it was quite impressive to see this as front page and second page news. But as a sociologist, I was critical of how the LGBT community was being represented through the media, as a lot of sociology scholars are and sociology students. But it did make me think about if somebody was sitting at breakfast looking at the LA Times, who was located in 1963, 50 years ago, let's say, how would they feel about the news in the paper today, you know, the kind of time machine. And some of my contexts are UK based, so it wasn't until 1967 with the Sexual Offences Act in the UK that gay men's sexuality was decriminalised. And it made me think that within our area of scholarship, since the sort of late 80s, early 90s, feminists and pro-feminists have worked hard to expose discrimination in terms of gender inequalities, and alongside that there's been a challenging of homophobia in sport. And so some of the kind of formal improvements around in many Western societies, and you know, I don't know how you get news in this country from African countries, but within my kind of area that I look at, football, there's a lot of male African players playing in the Premier League, soccer league. So we do get quite a bit of news from what's happening in Africa. And so there's places in Africa where homosexuality is still criminalised, and there's places in Russia and, you know, the kind of Winter Olympic movement. So in some Western societies, there's been an improvement legally around gay men's human rights and gay men's human rights within sport. And lesbians have also experienced a shift in social justice in some of these countries as a result of some of those advances. And I think within sports studies, scholars have done really well to document gay athletes, so Eric Anderson's work, and lesbian experience of sport. And I remember when I started my PhD in 1996, you know, Pat's book, Strong Women, Deep Closets, was really important, or you know, during that process of PhD and post-PhD. So I'd say within the scholarship of sexuality within sports studies, we've got a strong lesbian studies strand and a strong gay studies strand. But in terms of the present, I am a little bit concerned, and I know I've used the same acronym, but I'm a little bit concerned about the LGBT acronym that was used for this event. And working in activism a little bit, it does have cultural currency, so it is a useful acronym, both in the UK and the USA. And yet, I think we have to problematise the disparities within the group of LGBT. And I wrote something around young transgender men recently, and their experiences of not feeling a part of LGBT community. And I often wonder what happens to bisexuality. So although we have established research and writing around lesbian and gay experience in sport, we know little about bisexual and transgender. And of course there's intersex and queer. As with players coming out in this country, we've also had players come out in the UK. And examples some of you may or may not have heard of, but one of the first professional male players to come out was a black British soccer player, Justin Fashanu. He came out in 1991 and he took his own life in 1998 because of the difficulties experienced as an out soccer player. We've also had players come out in rugby, and I don't know if you know rugby, but it's quite a masculine macho, hyper-masculine macho sport, and also cricket. But since Justin Fashanu, we haven't had a player come out in soccer, which is probably the biggest sport in the UK. So there's a noticeable number of gay men in top-level sport coming out. And what's accompanying that, or what seems to be accompanying that, is campaigning. So there's small campaigns and there's larger campaigns. And I've done some work for the Justin campaign. And David Cameron has taken up some of these messages. And I think as sort of critical thinkers, we have to ask why a conservative right-wing politician is prepared to take on issues around homophobia and sexuality in sport. And this was tackling homophobia and transphobia, a plan of action that occurred in the UK. We had a Charter for Change. So it's very official. It's 2010, 2011. And the governing bodies of sport have got on board as well. So the Players Football Association, the FA is a huge governing body within the UK. They started to do some work around LGBT issues. And of course, you know, going back to my initial point, LGBT, at the moment, it often means gay men in sport, from what I can see is happening in the UK. And this was the latest one, which received a lot of media coverage earlier this year. And Paddy Power is a betting agency, gambling, and they have quite a foothold in football, soccer cultures in the UK. And they teamed up with Stonewall, which is a lobbying group that lobbies the government for change. And Stonewall is quite a middle-class, white, liberal type of lobbying movement. So at the present, I'm wondering, and I know Sammy's written on this and written really well on it, around processes of normalisation within neoliberalism and the sort of construction of homonormativity. You know, the well-behaved or the good sort of homosexual entering into arenas which were previously heavily heteronormative. And I wonder what, and I think Sammy might have asked the same question in her paper just now, what has happened to queer and what's happened to queer scholarship and what's happened to the queer movement that did seem to have some momentum. And I don't think there are easy answers because as I said, I think LGBT does have political cachet. In terms of the future, I think there's a need for more research around bisexuality, around transgender, around queer, and around intersex. And we do have some work on intersex, but it tends to be linked to the gender verification processes that the IOC are involved in. We don't have work that looks at intersex communities from the community or from the people. We have it from a policy initiative, which those of you who have done your reading, it's highly medicalised and as a result is pathologized in terms of intersex bodies, and it almost fits with the binary male-female sex body system. I think there's a call for us to look at the intersectionality of gender, sexuality, race, ethnicity, ability and disability. And some of the stuff that's happening in the public arena mirrors some of what's happening in academia. And queer theory was criticised for this at the beginning, that it was a very white male scholarship. And Heather Sykes is doing some really interesting work around post-colonial theory and sexuality. And I think her work, not only does it expose the colonial power relations that a lot of Western societies are involved in, it also is a reflexive term. And I think Heather has done some reflexivity around her own location as a white scholar. And I guess she's asking us all to look at whiteness. And I know in studies of sexuality, and I know Merrick MacDonald and Susan Burrell have also documented that issue. I also think there are transgender collectives and communities that are taking part in sport, and there's examples in Manchester in England around swimming and basketball. And I wonder how groups are recreating sport in a different way that's not the fitting into the NBA or the rugby football union or the cricket. They're not playing individuals who aren't playing elite competitive sport and bound by the ethos of competition. Are there communities that are recreating sport and physical activity that is more in line with practices that might fit their own communities around queerness and around collectives, as opposed to a lot of the research we have around intersex and transgender is often about one player that plays in a lesbian team or plays in a gay male team. We don't have research around groups of self-identified queer or intersex. And I wonder if this is the new queer sport movement that we need to keep an eye on. Bisexuality is almost hidden from the populations. There's a silencing around it. There was something in the Huffington Post recently about the stereotypes that go with bisexuality, and I just wonder what those stereotypes do in terms of silencing bisexual voices or containing bisexual voices. And finally, I think that the project of looking, and Sammy's kind of provided an exemplar of that, looking at the media and the mainstreaming and the production of homonormativity around sexuality, and that contentious issue around identity politics and queerness and the fluidity of queerness and sexuality. So I'll finish there.
Good morning, or I guess it's good afternoon now. How many people here are grad students? Just by raising hand. How many are undergrads? How many are athletes or coaches? Okay, great. Thank you. My current focus is the blend of advocacy and education. I feel like through most of my career, I was trying to blend those two things with scholarship, and very much interested in how the research that we do will make life better, promote social justice in sport. And by the same token, the reverse question is, how can those of us who are mostly focused on activism and education can better communicate with researchers and scholars to talk about what kind of questions that they could investigate that would help us to be able to move the ball forward in terms of making sport a more socially just place for people of all sexual orientations and gender identities. And to that end, a couple of years ago, there were actually a few of us in the room here, participated in a conference that George Cunningham organized at Texas A&M. It was a couple of day conference where he tried to pull together some people who were very much involved in activism around LGBT issues in sports, and some people who are doing some research on LGBT issues in sports to not only present a one-day conference, but also to have some conversations among ourselves about how we could better work together to try to change sport and to reach the goals that we as activists and educators are concerned about, is how do you make a place in sport that anybody can participate and feel like they can bring all of their full selves to that participation. What came out of that was a blog that is ongoing now, the LGBTQ sports blog, and also proceedings of the presentations that were made at the conference. Unfortunately, I felt like, beyond that, we sort of then went back to our separate worlds. The educators and activists went, back to educating and activism, and the researchers sort of went back to their worlds. And so we haven't really been able to pull that together. And that's always been a goal of mine, is I'm interested in the kinds of questions that researchers ask that will help us change sport. And it will make a difference in the lives of the coaches and the administrators and the athletes who are involved in sports. So, to that end, I'm interested in the kind of research that's both accessible so that the people who could benefit from that research. I want to broaden the conversation beyond researchers, beyond the people who read the refereed journals. One of my goals is to make sure that research is accessible and can be used by the people whose lives it affects, the people who are actually playing sports at all levels. And so that's been one of the things that is most interesting and useful to me. I think advocacy research that takes a critical perspective, a feminist perspective, a queer perspective, and how the research is organized is very helpful in organizing the questions that I think they can be most useful. And some of the questions that I would love to see researchers pay attention to that I think would be really helpful for those of us who are mostly involved in the education and advocacy world are some of the following. And these have both been mentioned by both Samantha and Jane, is addressing the issue of gender and sexism and paying attention to how the stories of women athletes, in particular lesbian athletes, lesbian and bisexual women athletes, always seem to get submerged. And paying more attention to how the experience of heterosexism and sexism together make the experiences of male and female athletes a different experience. And paying more attention to the ways in which, partly because I think the way the media covers LGBT issues in men's and women's sports, is that there's an implicit assumption often made is that, well, there are lesbians in sports. We've always known that. So it must be just great to be a lesbian in sport. So we can put that aside and pay attention to men's sports. And I think we see a lot of evidence of that in the current media coverage that Samantha was talking about and Jane also referred to. I think we need to examine that kind of question and really reveal the sexism and heterosexism and how that blends to obscure some of the really salient issues that are still important that we need to address in women's sports. I think another way that's reflected, and this is always surprising to me, and usually people in the room when I say this, is one of the things that's been really interesting that's been happening in the world of sport recently is the emergence of straight male allies, straight men in sport at the professional levels, at the college levels, coming out and talking about being a straight ally, whatever that means to them. We have not seen that so much in women's sports. It's very difficult to name prominent women athletes or coaches who have publicly identified themselves as allies in this LGBT sports movement. What's that about? We need to, and I think it's partly related to what I was referring to before, is that blend of sexism and heterosexism in the world, in the media, and in sport that sort of keeps those women silent, or at least visible. I think there's also the ongoing challenge of gender expression in women's sports. Traditionally, that's been about ponytails and makeup, for games, is actually seen almost as part of the uniform for women athletes in many ways. Challenging that and sort of understanding the ways in which that apologetic still operates, even though we see a tremendous progress in women's sports in terms of participation, and how being an athlete is not necessarily totally outside the role of being a woman in our culture anymore. There's still a lot of fear around being associated with lesbians, or at least presenting a traditional feminine image to kind of counterbalance the athleticism that women exhibit on the field. I love Brittany Griner and the other, Laisha Clarendon from Berkeley. Both of them are really pushing that sort of feminine expectation of feminine presentation in such interesting ways. So that's been a really exciting thing to me, to watch those young women do that. Again, echoing the call to foreground race and racism in our work around LGBT issues, as both activists and as researchers. We still have the default sort of unmentioned assumption of whiteness in the research, much of the research that we do. So we need to explore more visibly and pull that up and talk a lot more about white privilege and how that intersects with LGBT issues and heterosexism and sexism in sport, rather than sort of mentioning it briefly and then moving right back to sort of the white norm. We need to challenge ourselves, every one of us needs to challenge ourselves as activists, educators, and researchers in terms of how we integrate and center the issues of race and racism in our work. Another piece of research that I would like to examine more is, I mentioned briefly, the emergence of straight allies. I'd like to know a lot more about what that experience is about for straight allies in sport. What motivates them? How do they? What does that mean to them to call themselves an ally? What is the nature of the relationship between straight allies and LGBT people in sports? Does the concept of heterosexual privilege get factored in there? Or do people perceive it as sort of a benevolent relationship, to sort of, as a straight person's responsibility to help out the LGBT people on their teams or coaches? So I'm very curious about that. It's emerging. It's a very important part of the activist part of what we're doing, but I'd love to see it get examined a little bit more. We really need a deeper examination of the role of religion in organized sports, particularly evangelical Christian organizations, which are very much embedded in the culture of college, high school, professional, Olympic sport. It's at all levels. And what about the intersection of identities for LGBT people who identify as Christians? Just paying more attention to how that Christian hegemony plays out in sport, and specific in relationship to the visibility of LGBT people in sport. Gender identity. Again, echoing something that I think particularly Jane said, we often use the words LGBT, but really what we're talking about is capital G, small l, infinitesimal b, and usually completely absent t, or it's sort of like a dotted line. That's how I often think about it. We need to pay a lot more attention to really being clear when we just sort of say LGBT research or LGBT activism, that we're being included. I'd almost rather people say, if it's just going to be about gay men, that they just say it. And then I don't have to feel so frustrated. I mean, I probably still would be frustrated, and I think that's also true in the research that we're doing. Looking at the intersections of gender identity and sexual orientation, and paying a lot more attention to the experiences of transgender people, intersex people who don't, are not cisgender. What is their experience like in sport? We're starting to have enough athletes and beginning to have some coaches identify as transgender, so we can start to examine that experience. What makes their experience different from other athletes, and how, what's that what is that climate like to be a transgender athlete on a gender-separated team? We have absolutely, basically no research at the K through 12 level in looking at LGBT issues in sports. Almost all the research is centered at the college level, some maybe at the professional level, but we really don't know anything about heterosexism, sexism, racism, and how that gets manifested at the K through 12 level. So that's a giant hole. That's probably where the greatest need is in terms of the young people who are on those teams. We need to pay attention to that. I'd love to see some research on the perspective of athletic administrators. We don't know anything about that. You know, how does an athletic director think about balancing the inclusion issues of all kinds, and particularly in a Division I school where they're also concerned about making money and all of the other things that go along with big-time athletics. We don't know anything much about that. And in particular, I'm really interested in how athletic directors make sense of the toleration of abuse that we see popping up, it seems like, in the news on a regular basis. If it's not necessarily LGBT-based, it's just abuse of athletes. Although certainly with Mike Rice and the coverage of the situation at Rutgers, it was, you know, the use of homophobic language in that situation was something that, you know, where are athletic administrators on that? And what, you know, examining more carefully the role of coaches and the leeway that coaches have in an athletic department that you'd never have as a professor in a college classroom in terms of how athletes are treated, how students are treated. And then finally, we now have, thanks to the great work of a lot of activists and educators, we have a number of interventions that are happening in colleges, in particular around the country, in terms of workshops for coaches and athletes, speakers, ally pledges, making You Can Play videos. We have all these interventions that are geared toward the goal of making athletics a great place for people of all sexual orientations and gender identities. But we have no idea if they work. We just sort of have, you know, it seems like they should, you know, and I certainly feel better when I participate in all those things. And people say that it helps, but we don't know. We don't have any information about the actual change in behavior, change in attitudes, whether it's long-lasting, about the interventions that we're developing and using in terms of our education and activism work. So I'll stop.
Well, as I said, I'd prepared a few questions, and a couple of them I can just already check off because they've already been spoken on, and especially I was going to ask about the LA Times story yesterday, which to me was kind of funny in part because it felt like it actually could have been, not in 1960, but it could have been a story in LA Times in 1992. I mean, there have been men's gay softball leagues in the Hollywood area for years, but still, I found it very interesting to see that appear in the front of the LA Times. And we looked at the last 10 years of the major sport journals, and we asked how many articles in these sport journals focused on the experiences of kids, and it was really, really tiny. There was some stuff on youth sports, like some of the stuff I've done in the past that focuses on the adults in youth sports, but not so much on the kids. And one of the interesting things that's happening, I think, today is, for instance, with the emergence of transgender kids and youth, the medical institution, I think, is really kind of reeling to try to figure out what to do with intersex kids and then slightly older kids and young people who are transgender. And there's a lot of talk within the medical institution about that. Schools, elementary schools, middle schools are trying to figure out, you know, what to do about this. I know in California there's discussion at local levels in school districts about transgender kids. And it seems to me sport, you know, it's no big surprise, sport often lags behind in terms of social change in a lot of these sorts of things. It's very rarely out on the forefront of social change, and sport continues to sort of reproduce these male-female binaries, and to the extent that gay and lesbian athletes start coming out a bit more, they seem to kind of get plugged into and normalized into the same binaries. But what happens with transgender kids in sport, and what is a good research agenda that would help us understand today, at a time when I think there's an increasing emergence of transgender kids, and with youth sports, with school-based sports, how might researchers focus on that? What kind of questions might we ask that would help us not just understand what's happening within sport, but how sport kind of connects to other aspects of people's lives?
I think one piece of it is investigating a little bit more about what, because I think the whole issue of transgender identity, has to do with how you see your body and your connection to your body, and I think sport participation for young transgender people, it's in some ways, I don't want to say it's more important, but it's certainly as important as for a cisgender young person, because of those issues around their relationship to the body that they have. And I think, if for no other reason, we need to make that clearer to people. Not only just sort of basic education about transgender identity within the sports world or in schools in general, but what does it mean for a young person to be able to have access to play the sports that are offered in schools or participate in the recreation activities in a school, and to sort of highlight why that's even more important, perhaps, to someone who identifies as transgender. So that's one area of investigation, is to really highlight the importance of that in terms of how they feel about themselves as a bodied person, a transgendered bodied person.
Yeah, I mean, I must admit it's not, the specific question around transgender kids in sport is not something I've thought about, but probably like many of you, I've seen now endless of these videos and interviews that are posted online with very, very young transgender children talking in extremely articulate ways about their identities and their experiences. And so I don't think it would be out of the realm of, a sensible way to approach it to sort of ask them actually about that and their experiences and how they feel about that. And I also think I just read the really good piece in GLQ by Erica Rand about Johnny Weir and Kyle Alums. Is that how you pronounce it? Alums, okay. And one of in a very complex piece, one of the points she makes is that actually, women's basketball was not a completely hostile place for someone like Kyle to grow up through. I mean, it's much more complicated than that. So I think, I guess, recognizing that sport doesn't have to be and isn't always a hostile space, and then trying to nurture those aspects of it that are that allow for different kinds of identifications is really important.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I was just trying to think as Pat and Sammy were speaking. I guess, there's lots of problems with sport, so sometimes I wonder we should just change sport, and in the UK we have a national curriculum that is taught in all the schools, and within that national curriculum there's certain sports that are deemed significant in terms of educating around physical movement. And that's often been challenged because it tends to be your invasion games, the traditional sports, and each time there's a new government, so Cameron's coalition government, there was an emphasis on the Olympics and competitive sport and getting more boys playing cricket and football. So I wonder, can we invent sport differently? And it doesn't seem that we can, because it's been so obdurate for so long. And a project I was involved in where we tried to maybe educate the children differently was a project that fell under the realm of sport for development and peace. And so there's quite a movement now towards using sport to help people in divided societies or societies that have experienced conflict. So for a UK location, somewhere like Northern Ireland, where there's conflict between Catholic and Protestant, has been going on for decades, and also in Israel, where there's conflict between Arab communities and Jewish communities. And so the Football for Peace project I was involved in had a coaching methodology where undergraduate students who were doing physical education and sports studies could volunteer to work on the project, and certain values had to be delivered through the coaching process at the same time as the skills that were involved in, and this was football. And I wonder whether, trying to get young transgender people involved in something with non-transgender young people in terms of understanding and having some empathy. And this word empathy is quite significant within peace studies and peace movement, as well as the advocacy, the notion of advocacy. So I wonder if coaches might be able to change their methodological approach in a quite a systematic way. So when these young people play the games, they have no referees. So I don't know if you played out when you were kids, but you played without officials a lot of the time, at 6, 7, 8, 9 years old. So that's how we learn to play with each other. And the teams that won weren't the teams that scored the most goals. They were the teams that demonstrated these behaviours around respecting, so Arab, Jewish boys, and it was mostly boys, respecting Arab boys, and vice versa, Arab boys respecting Jewish boys. So maybe it's something that coaches or providers or the education system. And I don't know if you saw the picture where it says tackling homophobia and transphobia. That's the government have made or the British government have made a pledge to tackling transphobia, and I mean I don't know how they're going to do that in schools. They've got no strategy. It's a.
It's interesting that they're claiming it as a goal, though, just in and of itself, I think. Well, one other question, and we have a few more minutes after that to open up, that each of you have also touched on this in a different sort of way. But I'm interested in your thoughts on to what extent we sometimes as scholars track along too closely to popular discourses about what's going on in the world of sport. And what I'm thinking of here specifically is the sort of coming out narratives and also the decline of homophobia, which is something that with opinion polls and so forth we can kind of track that there is an actual sort of decline of homophobia if we think of that as internalized attitudes, negative attitudes towards gay and lesbian people, and instead thinking about the ways in which sport still, even in a context of declining homophobia, that sport still in some ways might continue to reinforce heteronormativity. And I'm thinking about here, to hang this on something concrete, the ways in which, I'm not sure if this is as relevant, especially in the UK, maybe in Canada, but here where we have college sports, the way there's been focus been put on in the last few years on so-called negative recruiting in women's college basketball, where, for those of you who haven't heard of that, I'll explain it real quickly, that let's say you're the coach here at USC of the women's basketball team, and you're sitting in the living room of a high school girl that you're trying to recruit to your team with her parents, and you have to recruit the parents to your team. And what you do is you flash your wedding ring, you mention your husband, you mention your kids, you say, gee, we're a very family-friendly team. And all the while, you don't have to say anything negative about homosexuality, but underneath you also know that this same high-profile high school athlete is being recruited across town by a team where the coach is a single woman, and there's questions about, is she gay, and are there a lot of lesbians on that team, and might she be, if my daughter goes to this team, might she be recruited into lesbianism? So it plays, of course, on homophobic fears, but only by asserting something positive, which is that we're family friendly. And I'm wondering if there are ways in which we can expand our vocabulary of research to capture a little bit more of a nuanced, critical view of one of some of the ways that still there are mechanisms within sport and between sport and other institutions that are not changing that much.
Well, University of Minnesota they have done a little bit of this in looking at the media guides. They looked at the media guides that every team has, you know, and there's always the coach's bio in the media guide, and looking at, and usually for heterosexual coaches anyway, the last sentence is, Coach Griffin lives in Belchertown, Massachusetts with her husband Steve and their 3 children, Mary, John, and Susie. And but for lesbian coaches, by and large, except for a very small minority of coaches who are brave enough to put something in there about their families, there's just nothing.
Yeah.
So you have either claiming heterosexual identity by, you know, claiming your heterosexual spouse and family, or nothing.
It's not that she's single, it's that her family's invisible.
Yes.
Right.
So, you know, and typically the lesbian thing will read, you know, Pat Griffin lives in Belchertown, Massachusetts with her dog Toby. So it becomes, again, without, you know, saying anything, a way to sort of proclaim heterosexuality, you know, for parents and athletes who are interested in that. So anyway, at University of Minnesota, they've done some really interesting research taking a look at that and sort of documenting, you know, how many times, you know, that happens and how infrequent it is for a lesbian coach to claim her identity by mentioning a spouse and children in the bio. And so I think, you know, there has been some research that's beginning to look at that whole issue of negative recruiting and the more subtle versions of it, which I would count all the things you say, and the University of Minnesota study, because it's also not subtle. There are coaches who actually do say, you don't want to go to that school because the coach is a lesbian, or you don't like the lifestyle issues there, or something like that. So.
Yeah, I'm not, I don't know that I have much to add. I will just, I guess I have an anecdote to share, which is that, you know, I don't have the kind of experience that Pat has dealing with these issues on the ground, but I did recently get a phone call from someone whose daughter had been harassed off a team at a Division I school. She's Canadian, but a Division I U.S. school, and she had contacted me because friends of mine who were friends of hers knew that I was queer and that I worked on sport and so on. And so I ended up spending a lot of time talking with them about the situation, and eventually passed them on to the National Center for Lesbian Rights, because I, you know, that they were sort of waiting to see what happened. They were going through a process with the school, and it was completely unsatisfactory. And this, those of you who are familiar with some of the stories from Penn State with this person, this student also, I don't know how she identifies. Her parents don't know how she identifies. But they understood very clearly that was actually beside the point. And what I thought was really interesting about she made a decision to leave the university. They had taken a scholarship away and everything, and she's now enrolled in another school and they sought out a school with a lesbian coach who was out, so that she didn't have to go through this again. And so I thought that was it's a terrible story, and it's ongoing and it's not resolved. But I actually thought that was a sign of something kind of positive. Very straight, very Christian family that made that decision because they understood how the institution of homophobia was operating. So, yeah.
We have a completely different system,
Yes.
so we don't. So I can't really.
Okay. So we have about close to 20 minutes, I think, left. I think we'll open up for questions or comments. Yes.
For Jane on this campaign, there was a lot of controversy in the gay community about the campaign because of the right behind gay football players was seen as reinforcing stereotypes about gay men in the locker room. Can you address that and what you thought? Do you think it was effective at all?
Yeah. This has happened I was in Australia and they were giving out rainbow socks to hockey teams and lots of hockey teams, so this kind of straight alliance. And it seems to be a kind of visual politics around teams supporting LGBT. And so these are rainbow laces, and they tried to get the teams in the men's Premier League, which has huge kind of power within UK societies at weekends and during the week, to wear these laces. And some of them did and some of them didn't. But the organisation, Paddy Power, is a betting company, and Everton is sponsored by Paddy Power, so they wore them. So it's a bit, but it's quite a rush campaign. Stonewall endorsed it. But Football v Homophobia, which is another campaigning group, said it just relies on innuendo and it trivialises gay men's sexuality. So the idea of anal sex, gay men are reduced to. So there was a big debate that week in the media, and it kind of happened, but it didn't happen in the way. And Paddy Power actually got publicity, regardless of the campaign. There's a real fascination with a footballer, a soccer player coming out in the UK, because it's not happened in that sport. And there's a lot of the campaigns are saying they're trying to change the culture of the sport, it's not about a player coming out. But this is the, I mean, my personal kind of take on it is it's just trivialised, it's just sensationalised. You know, the strap line's very stereotypical. It sort of buys into stereotypes, and it might go with the fact that, you know, there's homophobia in a direct way is no longer accepted, and within the culture of soccer, racism has been addressed for 2 decades, 3 decades, and so to be racist in a stadium now, you'll get ejected from the stadium. But then there's colleagues of mine have looked at how racism is now percolating in a very subtle, very everyday, very taken for granted way. And a colleague of mine wrote something around Muslim men and cricket, and it was entitled "That Joke's Not Funny Anymore." You know, this kind of idea that humour and joking makes things better, whereas actually if it's buying into stereotypes, it can be. I don't know, what do other people think about it? Anybody prepared to speak out?
Other questions then? Yes?
I had read a few pieces about athletes who feel like they're pressured to reveal their sexuality when, why does that have anything to do with the sport at all? Like, while they can be sort of like martyrs and big figures and really change things, some of them really don't feel like they want to express that. And I read something about a gay athlete who didn't want to come out or publicly do anything about it, but his manager had told him, like, this would be a great PR move, like, this is the best thing you can do for your career, like, all sorts of, like, things that we think opposite, but now there's, like, sort of a pressure, like, come out, be that first person, like, be the hero for the sport, and a lot of people just don't feel comfortable doing that. I'm just kind of wondering why is it so important to reveal these sort of things?
Do you want to
I'll go. I have so many things that I would like to say. Let me see where I can start first. Personally, I mean, I'm a person who doesn't believe anybody should come out until they're ready. And added to that, I think that it's the same thing that happened in the early LGBT movement, not outside of sport, just the general movement in the United States. It was a big thing, come out wherever you are, and everybody was supposed to come out. It also ignores other parts of people's identities. It's not a person of color who identifies as LGBT coming out is not the same as a white person. A woman coming out is not the same as a gay man coming out. So it's, you know, it sort of ignores all the complexities in our identities, saying that everybody should come out, sort of erases those differences. So that's another piece of it. And again, I think that I like the way you put it, that the goal should be about changing the culture of sport, not about getting people to come out. If people, I'm a big proponent, you know, having experienced it myself personally, you know, I feel like my life is better because I'm out. But I think that people, you know, some people are not willing, they're out in their private lives, probably Abby Wambach, who just came out this week, because she got married. She didn't like have an announcement, the soccer player. But she strikes me as a person like that. I mean, everybody kind of knew that she was a lesbian, but she never owned it publicly. And I think that I'm sure she felt a lot of pressure to do that. And I'm not a person who believes that people should be forced to identify themselves publicly for, a variety of reasons. So I think the emphasis should be on changing the culture, not on getting people to come out. And I wish we could sort of take the emphasis off of that a little bit.
You were talking about how it's sort of, there's like all these assumptions of race and sexuality and all these things that no one would ever come out as straight. So it's sort of like, I don't mean to trivialize it, but it's kind of like, why does it have to be such, you don't come out as straight, it doesn't have to do with the sport or anything.
Oh, okay.
Coming out is such an event now.
All right. Okay, good. Let me say something about that. We live in a world, would you agree that we live in a world that sort of the assumption is that everybody's heterosexual unless you wear a rainbow pin or you make an announcement or, present your gender in a way that people associate with being LGBT. So, I mean, that's sort of the general assumption that we're all heterosexual unless somebody, interrupts that assumption in some way. So, straight people don't have to come out. It's okay for a straight coach to put a picture of his or her spouse on the desk in the athletic department. And a gay or lesbian person who does that, it's a statement. So because of the differences in privilege between straight people and gay people and the effects of heterosexism and the assumptions we make about heteronormativity and everything, it's not the same act. The heterosexual people can reveal their sexuality in many ways and do it unconsciously every day. And so, it becomes a more political act, an act of self-affirmation when an LGBT person does it in a way that it's not the same for straight people. I don't know if that helps to differentiate a little bit of it.
Yeah, and I think, I agree with everything Pat said. I think people should get to choose what they do and what they say. And I mean, coming out has an incredibly important history. I mean, it's been a way of forming communities, queer communities, and recognizing each other and all of that. But the overemphasis on it, I think, is very constraining, especially on celebrity comings out, which again I think are different than public announcements are different than more everyday comings out. I think about Cheryl Swoops a lot when I think about this question because. She and I identify very personally with Cheryl Swoop's story in some ways, and I thought the way that she talked about her identity was so great. So she was married to a guy, and then she got involved in a relationship with a woman, and she came out, but she was very clear, even though the media tried to spin it as she was repressed and now free, she was very clear, no, I just made a choice, like I fell for this woman, and then they broke up, and now she's going to be married to, or is married to, I tried to find out today, but Wikipedia let me down, if the exchange of vows has occurred. But she's going to get married to a guy again, and she got so much criticism when she came out for saying that this wasn't natural from some within the LGBT community. For not sort of claiming a lesbian identity, and then of course she was a disappointment to people when she switched teams again, and so I think that her story is a really good example of how we should keep an eye on our attachments to coming out.
It also highlights the challenge of integrating bisexuality, because
Right.
there are so many assumptions that go along with that. And she would not claim that label either, I'm sure. I don't know Cheryl, but I am sure she would not claim that as a label either. But it sort of highlights again how we want to make it so simple. And it's very complex how we think about ourselves.
And I think your comment also for me highlights the importance of maybe just echoing something Sammy said earlier in her comments, that the meaning of coming out is contextual and historically contextual. I mean, if it's in a context of a movement, like when you're saying come out wherever you are in the early 1970s and mid-1970s, the context of a movement had a certain meaning for building community and for social change. Coming out in a more commercial context for celebrities now, I think, has a different kind of meaning. And probably not too long ago, for most well-known athletes, a lot of them didn't come out because they thought it would be they'd be commercially punished by that, which, as Billie Jean King was when she came out years ago, losing a lot of endorsements. But it might be today that in certain sports, in certain contexts, certain places, that somebody's agent might have decided that it's commercially a good thing to come out. And I think the meanings of those kinds of coming outs we have to look at in a different sort of way. Other hands. Yes. Yes.
Okay. Pat, you really got me thinking when you're sort of offering possibilities for future research or gaps in knowledge, in particular in relation to the lack of research on sports in the K through 12 arena, and as well as the lack of research on non-traditional sports. So I kind of wanted to see if I might make an offering to all of you of what could be considered an athletic activity that falls into both of these domains where we're lacking some research, and see if y'all have thought about this at all, or you might be interested to. And the particular activity I'm thinking about has been given some press recently in the popular media with the show Glee. So the activity I'm thinking about is show choir, which is a huge sort of, very popular sport in the Midwest and in the high school where I grew up. And it's interesting because it is very much enmeshed in these heteronormative scripts and gendered scripts. Boys dance with girls, the girls wear dresses, the guys wear tuxes, there's the makeup, blah, blah, blah. But from what I've seen and heard from show choir forums online and this type of thing, it's also sort of a nice locus where people from all sorts of different sexualities can be and be safely. It sort of occupies these two very different worlds, and like there's the heteronormative codes versus there's tons and tons of LGBTQ folks who are taking part in this activity. So I don't know if y'all have thought about show choir as a non-traditional or as a sport. I think it raises some very interesting questions about sexuality, about race and class, also religion, in my experience.
If I'd grown up in the Midwest, I would have wanted to be in one. I know that. Yeah.
I have a hard time thinking of it as a sport.
Yeah, but I mean, that's, I guess, another interesting part of it sort of challenges the traditional definition of what is sport. This was pretty hotly contested back in the days when I was in high school. The show choir did, we do more physical activity than the golf team.
Well, I think one of the reasons why sport is such a challenge around LGBT issues, or has been, although we've made such rapid change in the last 2 or 3 years, is its traditional association with masculinity. Show choir, drama club, I think of high school activities that are not typically associated with masculinity. Makes it easier. It sort of breaks that hold, makes it easier for young people to be accepted and express alternative gender identities and sexualities. That's been my experience. I know when they started the Safe Schools program in Massachusetts, the first director, Jeff Brody, he co-wrote a book about that whole movement, and he called it "When the Drama Club is Not Enough." And it's for a reason that the drama club, I would imagine, what is it called? Show
choir.
Show choir.
Very active, lots of movement, but just dancing.
Mm-hmm. It sort of falls in that same realm of an activity that, particularly probably for boys who do not express their gender in a traditionally masculine way, or who identify as gay, there's a place for them there.
Do we have time for one more? Yeah, in the back, I know you had your hand up.
Yeah,
Yes.
I wanted to ask you about bisexuality and why you think it's so overlooked. I know a couple of sisters who said she's bisexual, and a lot of people in her community, she lives in New York, she's in Tisch, they say, bisexual's not a thing, and they're gay, they're lesbian, And it's like shut down by their own community, really. And I just want to know your insight on why.
I just saw it on a news feed on Facebook this morning, but the Huffington Post, there was a woman writing about
Anna Augenis,
Yeah.
director of Go Athletes, which is a
and
terrific
she was claiming that bisexual women experience more harassment than lesbians and heterosexual women. And going back to this process of coming out, there's a coming out to the the heterosexual communities, there's a coming out to the LGBT community. But the same, when I did some research with some young transgender men, they found the LGBT community quite difficult to navigate as well. But it was a place where they felt a lot safer than the straight community. I think there's a lot of stereotypes around bisexuality. You can't make your mind up. You're sitting on the fence. You're being greedy.
You can't make up your mind.
Yeah, and I think those, if those stereotypes were made about gay men or lesbian women, there would be some challenging going on. So I don't think we know enough really around bisexuality I'm not sure I want to fix it down as an identity. I feel more comfortable with the word queer, but I do think some people do attach to bisexuality, and I think maybe there's a feeling of privilege that when it gets too difficult in the LGBT community, you're kind of part of a privileged community as well. So I think it is quite a difficult location within sporting kind of moments to negotiate. And I mean, some people argue, Freud argued that we're all bisexual, and there's a kind of omnipresence of bisexuality. It's about opening up kind of sexuality as fluid, isn't it? And bisexuality kind of addresses that full on as this kind of, and it does collapse the binaries. So politically, it could be quite a useful, if there was an identity of politics around it, politically it could be quite a useful identity politics to take.
Well, I think it doesn't collapse the binary, right? That's the thing. I mean, I think it's true. This goes back to the Sheryl Swoopes thing, right? We're invested in singular identities, and so bisexuality just doesn't. Whether it's hetero or homo, but bisexuality explodes that. But at the same time, I think that some of the skepticism from within the communities around the bi and the notion of binary, right? But I think people should get to call themselves what they want, and that it's a real identification for people. But I think it's true that it's somewhat marginalized.
And I think bisexual men have a very different experience to bisexual women within the LGBT community. And I think that would be quite interesting to explore how bisexual men are considered within sporting contexts.
I think people who identify on the borders of identities, whether we're talking about biracial people, transgender people, bisexual people, get viewed with suspicion by the people who are targeted by that particular kind of oppression. Because, you have to be with us or against us. That going back to
selling out,
get in your box. So it's just it's something we have to push ourselves not to let happen.
Do you think more acceptance in the community would come once there's more general acceptance of being gay and kind of fluid sexuality rather than being with the gay community or being with the straight community? I mean, they're just basically, she's like, I just say whatever people want me to say. If I'm with my gay friends, I say I'm gay. If I'm with my straight friends, I say I'm straight. So it's just interesting because it's all mixed. So.
Well, I hope that you can feel comfortable saying what's true for you, and and not feel like you have to identify yourself in a way just to I would wish that for anyone.
Well, and then to tie that up in a little sport knot for us, since I think we're out of time, people popularly talk about that as playing for both teams, I think. So, please join me in thanking our guests.